Welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast. Today, I'm speaking with Professor of Organisational Psychology and Change at Manchester Metropolitan University, Damian Hughes. This episode of the Pacey Performance Podcast is sponsored by Val Performance, the team behind the NordBord hamstring testing system. So the NordBord is the fastest and easiest, most accurate way to measure hamstring strength. So with the NordBord, you'll get the right information to make the right decisions at the right time. If you want to check them out, you can check them out at valdperformance.com. This episode of the Pacey Performance Podcast is sponsored by Train with Push, creators of the Push Band. So the Push Band is the first scientifically validated wearable device to provide objective insights into your performance in the gym. So using accelerometers and a gyroscope, the Push Band is able to use bar speed to regulate load and volume based on your ability in the gym on any given day. So you can use the Push Band to quickly establish 1 RMs with submaximal load so you can plan with confidence. So the Push Band portal also allows you to create programs before entering the gym to make change on the fly depending on how you are performing on that given day. So you can customize everything from target velocity ranges to differentiating velocities for warm-up and creating working sets and supersets for yourself or your athletes. So if you do want to know more about Train with Push and the Push Band, get yourself over to trainwithpush.com. They also got a great blog, so you can catch up with some guest bloggers such as Mladen Ivanovic and Dan Baker. So be sure to check them out at trainwithpush.com. Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to the Pacey Performance Podcast. So really pleased this evening to get Damian Hughes, who is the Professor of Organisational Psychology and Change at Manchester Met. So welcome to the podcast, Damian.
Oh, thanks, Rob. Thanks for having me.
I got that job title right there.
Yeah, just about.
So anyone that doesn't know who you are, just want to give us a little bit of a background on maybe what you've done in the past and what you're currently doing.
Yeah, of course. So I come from a boxing background, Rob. So I've had to run a boxing club in Manchester all my life, really. So my dad was a elite level boxing coach, and that's what I grew up in, and that's what I worked in. I then worked as a football coach for a number of years. I did a job for Manchester United, and now I work I do 4 different jobs effectively. I do the organisational psychology and change role that we just described. I write books very much around change and high-performing cultures. I run a consultancy that works in business and in sport, and I still keep involved with the boxing as well.
So what role was it at United that you did? Was it in the academy, coaching the academy?
Yeah, well, when I started, it was a very, very junior role as a junior coach there at the academy. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, I read as we were speaking before, I read one of your books, probably 2012, after my non-league kind of forward-thinking manager bought about 15 of them to give out to the lads. So it was the first time that I'd read a book that almost made me reflect on what I was doing, and there was space in the book for obviously writing answers to certain questions that were asked. But how did the kind of the title of the author? How did you where did that come from that you wanted to write a book?
Yeah, cool. Well, I'd never actually wanted to write a book. I'd never intended to do one. And I was doing a role where I was trying to help an organisation get a high-performing culture in place. And I'd done a lot of work in terms of from my own academic background and my own background in sport to put in place initiatives to get these guys making that mindset shift to do it. And I was looking for a book that merely just reinforced the messages we've been given. And my issue was twofold. One, if it was too wishy-washy, these guys were too cynical. They were never going to pick up a book that wasn't robust enough. But the robust books seemed to be a little bit too academic, which would also put them off. So I was in a dilemma in terms of what to give them to reinforce the messages. So the answer appeared obvious that I wanted to write my own. I thought it'd be better to write my own. So I was literally so naive. I think if anyone would have ever sat me down and said, this is how you write a book, I would never have bothered. It would have appeared too difficult. But I literally set off with the idea that I wanted to write a book around the psychology of change and how you can change to deliver high performance. And I decided what I was going to do was make a list of people that I liked and admired and interview them along the way. And I worked on the basis that we're only over 6 degrees of separation from anyone. So I thought, whoever is on the list, I'll work out a way to get to see them. So it ended up being an 18-month, really quite a fun adventure. I spent time with Sir Richard Branson and his family. Went out to Atlanta, I interviewed Muhammad Ali, interviewed Ferguson at United. Just people that I liked, like heroes of mine, that I got to go and interview and talk to them about it. And that was where the first book, Liquid Thinking, came in. But then I self-published it. So I published it just for this. So again, the idea was just to give it to the guys I was doing some work with. But it got quite a lot of attention at the time. So I eventually some publishers came along and acquired the rights to it in a book called Liquid Thinking. And that was very much the start of it. So that's about 14 years ago now that I did that.
Wow.
And, you know, I'm really proud I've done 10 now. So, it's a real passion of mine to like, I love doing the research, I love doing the interviews, I love sort of pursuing, avenues of thought and then going speaking to people that have really lived at the hard edge of it, who have been really generous with a lot of the time and insights, especially on the psychology of how they do what they do.
Mm-hmm. And I know this is a question that you've been asked a million times, but what are the commonalities between the kind of people that you've been speaking to?
Yeah, it's a brilliant question, Rob. I'd say what I've tried to do is I've got the new book that I've done probably sums up what the commonalities are. So what I've done is basically try and identify what are the features that all of these guys have in common. So regardless of their industry, regardless of the sport they might work in, regardless of their status or rank, who are the great coaches, the guys that make change happen, the guys that really deliver high performance over a sustained period? And I've identified there's 5 things. So the book's called The 5 Steps, and the steps is just an acronym for what I've noted that these guys seem to do consistently across the board. So to summarise it, the S of it is they're brilliant at simplifying things. So they've just got the ability to drill down and make things as simple and understandable as possible. So some examples of that, you know, there's the famous story about when a couple of psychologists went and watched John Wooden, the famous basketball coach, doing a session. And that was their insight. They took one insight away from over 1,000 hours of his coaching sessions. It was the simplicity of his messages. They said that no speech he ever gave lasted for longer than 20 seconds. Now, you look in other sporting leaders, like Alex Ferguson was renowned for being able to deliver a team talk in 3 words. You know, on one occasion, he walked in the room and said, "Lads, it's Tottenham," and walked out before one game. Jurgen Grobler, British rowing. You know, the whole culture of British rowing was about just getting the athletes to ask themselves, will this make the boat go faster? And it's about how do you almost drill down into a culture and summarise what you're about in a really simple, coherent way. The second part of the acronym is the T bit, which stands for great coaches get people to think for themselves. So they're not spoon feeding, they just create an environment that get people to use their own natural intelligence to solve problems. So, and we've seen this, I mean, the education is battling with the same thing, but we've seen that if you just spoon feed people, give them the answer, tell them what to do, when they come under pressure, they retain about 5% of the information. But when you get them to think for themselves and solve the problems themselves, they can retain up to about 75% of it. So what great coaches do is basically build in the phrase I talk about is they're building tripwires, things that just get you out of your autopilot and force you to think for yourself. So Mourinho's a great example of this, where he uses the whole coaching technique of guided discovery. So he sets you a problem and then allows you to solve it in the coaching sessions, but he plays a part of the opposition that basically keep trying to counter you and force you to think about it. The E part of the acronym is emotional intelligence. So the best coaches are the ones that just have that intuition for how people are feeling. And the best example I had for that was I did a book a number of years ago on a boxer, a guy called Thomas Hearns, and I went out to Detroit to the Kronk gym where he'd sort of developed and then spent his career. And it was frightening. I mean, the environment of where the gym was based was quite intimidating, just because of a lot of the sort of social issues around it. And what fascinated me when I got into this environment was this gym, despite being quite intimidating, has produced over 20 world champions. And the question I asked the head coach there, a guy called Emmanuel Stewart, was, how have you delivered such a phenomenal record of success? And he used a lovely phrase that almost sums up the E part, the emotional intelligence part. He said, you always need to contain before you explain. He said, most coaches get it wrong. He said, but the great coaches have got this ability to contain the emotional part of your brain. And what he meant by that was, he said, you could have the most talent in the world, but if you come into my environment and you think that I don't care about you, or I don't love you, or I have no interest in you, or I'm going to humiliate you, or you don't feel safe, you're incapable of listening to what I've got to give you. You're incapable of performing to your potential. And he said, but if I can contain that emotional brain and make you feel valued and secure and belong, your natural talent will take care of itself. So lots of coaches have got, that, like, if you speak to anyone about great coaches, they don't always remember what they tell you, but they remember how you made them feel. The P part of it is the practical. I've never yet met an elite coach that engages in sort of corporate bullshit or jargon to an extent. Because if there's a distinction between an expert and a novice, it's an expert has the ability to speak in abstract terms. So because they've been that well immersed and involved in to their subject, they understand the intricacies and the nuances of it. But a novice doesn't have that level of insight. So what great coaches have got the ability to do is, even though they might have like the ability to think about it, say 5 or 10 steps ahead of a novice, they can still explain it in novice terms. So they don't use jargon or abstract concepts to explain what they're doing. They always talk about it in really practical, concrete language. And the final bit of the acronym is all great coaches are great storytellers. I think the two things go hand in hand with each other. So, you'll often hear it. I know from your experiences, Rob, when we were talking earlier about like back in your non-league days when you were working in an environment like that. What was it we did? We were instantly telling stories about people we had in common. Because when we tell stories, you're taking the learning from it and you're being able to assimilate it and take the really relevant points in a lot more of an accessible way. So we know that our brain learns more when it's put within a context of a story. And that's what you find great coaches coach often by telling stories and getting people to almost step inside what is like a flight simulator of a certain scenario, but they can do it in a safe way.
Mm-hmm. So when with the emotional intelligence, when you told that story about the boxing coach, what did he do to get to contain before he explained?
Well, there's 4 things that all coaches do, and he did it as well. But we often talk about the 4. So when I work in cultures, and in any culture, whether this is sport, business, education, there are 4 things, the 4 pillars of emotional intelligence, or what I call it. The first one is you create a sense of belonging. And what I mean by that is that our natural instinct is that we're pack animals, that we want to feel that we fit in. That's our instinct. So what great coaches do is they create this sense of comradeship, this sense of we're all in it together. This teamship becomes really, really critical and fundamental. So they break down cliques very, very quickly because they understand how damaging and corrosive they can be. Now, there's lots of ways you can do this. You have like this unifying sense of purpose, or you get everybody, like Ferguson did it with the siege mentality at United, but effectively what you're doing is you're bringing everybody into the same sort of area together and making sure that sense of belonging is key. The second one is to create a sense of psychological safety. Now, there's been all kinds of studies for this. I've seen this in the hospitals, for example, where the best hospitals are the ones that also often have the highest mistake rate. And the reason that might sound counterintuitive, but the reason is it's only because people feel safe enough that they can admit mistakes. So the more mistakes they are, actually, the better the hospital in reality, because they've got that psychological safety. Now, so what I mean by that is, what great coaches never do is come in and hammer you for what you haven't done. They will always start by telling you what you have done well before they try and get you to understand how can you do something better, if that makes sense. So that's the second one. The third pillar is they create a sense of value, which is linked to the safety bit, but they spend an awful lot of time telling you what you're good at. They go in and play to your strengths rather than to your weaknesses. They emphasise your qualities rather than your defects. And the fourth one is they give you a sense of control. Now, we've seen this. There's a couple of professors called Gary Locke and Edward Latham have done all kinds of studies in sport and in business. And what they found is when you give people an element of control over their own targets, they tend on average to be about 18% more effective than when targets are just imposed on them. Now, I often say this when I work in business and say, that's a day a week. So even if you want to be cynical about it, that potential uplift of 18% has got to be worth investigating in more detail. You know, like you often see the sense of control in terms of, like you'll know and your listeners will know in terms of when you go into any dressing room, you see people engaging in superstitions or little quirks, whether it's putting the kit on in a certain order or leaving like walking out in a certain position. And that's often the emotional brain looking to establish some sense of control. When things start feeling out of control, you look for ways in which you can sort of try and consolidate and emphasize some degree of influence. So what great coaches do is they know the areas to give you that control and that authority. So it's those four pillars that are key, and that's what I saw in Detroit, but equally that's what I've been observing over the years with elite coaches and elite cultures. They tend to spend an awful lot of time investing in those areas.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned Alex Ferguson quite a few times. Obviously, he's been a massive influence on what you've done, obviously, hence the book. What obviously spending time with him on the inside and getting to know him, obviously not always seeing the press conference for 5 minutes after a game. Sure. What were the kind of underlying qualities that you saw of him as a man as well as him as a coach?
So first of all, I'd hesitate to say that I know Ferguson particularly well at all. But I did do a book called How to Think Like Alex Ferguson a couple of years ago, where I was lucky enough to speak to people that are far better qualified to answer that question than what I'd say I am. So I think I can answer on their behalf, if you like.
Yeah.
And when I asked the question, not dissimilar to you, the overwhelmingly popular answer people would give me was that he came across as a decent human being first and foremost. You know, and that's something that just doesn't fit with the sort of popular view that we have of him. But then equally, when people challenge that, I always say, well, do you believe everything you read in the papers? And the answer would be, well, no, of course I don't. So you say, well, why would you believe that the cartoon version that you subscribe to on Alex Ferguson, giving the hairdryer and being some kind of belligerent bully, would really be an accurate portrayal? Now, the simple answer is, stories of Ferguson losing his temper are far more newsworthy than stories of him being fundamentally a decent human being. But the amount of people that told me personal stories about where, you know, they could speak to him years later and he'd still remember the kids' names, or he'd ask about the parents, or he had an interest in the human being first and the football the second, is the thing that seems to distinguish him. But again, equally, it seems to distinguish all the great coaches. You know, I interviewed Angelo Dundee, who was Muhammad Ali's coach, and I interviewed him a long time ago, and he sort of pulled me up short when I said to him, "You coach boxers?" And he said, "No, I don't." He said, "I coach people to box." And it's a subtle distinction, but it's a powerful one when you realise you're dealing with human beings first and foremost. That always frames the way that you're likely to interact with them.
Mm-hmm. So just on the back of that, when it comes to, as we discussed before with previous guests, it's often come back to the word culture.
Yeah.
Through your kind of experience, how would people go about creating that culture? And it's a day after, it's not even 24 hours after England's got knocked out of the Euros, and that's what people are questioning. Not just the 11 guys on the pitch and ultimately, unfortunately, the manager, but the depth of that culture and the leadership and the people that maybe you don't see on the TV. From your experience, how would, not using that as an example because that's a crude example, but how would you go about kind of advising people on creating that deep-rooted culture?
Sure. Well, I mean, first of all, I hope it is accurate that we're not just going to go down the route after our failure in the European Championships, that we don't just do the usual tried and tested route of find a scapegoat, in this case Roy Hodgson, sack him, bring some charismatic new coach in and assume that everything's going to be fine again. I often quote, there's a stat that when Van Gaal failed as the Dutch coach in the first time, so when he quit in 2002, he made a really interesting observation that I think is worth bearing in mind in this sort of context, that he claimed then, when he reflected on their failure to qualify for the World Cup in 2002, that a coach can only influence a team's performance by about 10%. So he believed you can either improve it or decrease it by about 10%. So a large part of what he was about how did he maximise his 10% of influence. So he'd think of a lot of ways in which the way he could try and communicate better, or the way he could try and deliver his message or his tactics in a more effective way. And I think if that's true for somebody that's done the job and failed and then been successful as he was at the last World Cup, I think it's worth bearing in mind about Roy Hodgson that we can demonise him, we can sort of criticise him for what he did, but actually the problems lie a lot deeper in it, and it goes back to that very point you made, Rob, which is it's about culture. It's always about culture. You put think of it yourself. If you were to start a job and you start it, and one of your hallmarks in terms of your behaviour is you're passionate and you're enthusiastic, and I was to send you to go into work in a department of real cynical bastards, people that just love to complain or love to tell you what's wrong or the worst things about it, I guarantee within a 6-week period, you will dilute your levels of enthusiasm and passion a lot quicker than you will raise the standards of the people that come in. Because this is one of the things I said earlier about the way that we're wired to belong. We're pack animals by nature. This is why, now evolutionary psychologists will tell you a lot more detail about this, but one of our early lessons on our evolutionary journey was you don't go hunting on your own. Because you're basically exposing yourself and making yourself vulnerable. So we learn very quickly to hunt in packs or in tribes. So that's why religion is such a central pillar of every civilization. Right the way through today to things like Facebook, where we identify the kind of groups we want to belong to, or we do it for our football or our sports teams in different ways, the European referendum at the minute is about polarising people into different camps and things like that. So we're naturally inclined to want to belong. And what a culture is about is saying, well, what do you have to do to belong? So if you take that question right to its genesis, what a culture is about effectively is how do you behave? What are the acceptable behaviours in your group or for membership of that organisation? So the question I always start when I work with any team in this is to say, is to ask them, well, what are the behaviours? And some organisations seem to know this quite well. Some teams may struggle with it, but we're all capable of answering it. Where the phrase I use is to say, what are our trademark behaviours? So not only what are our behaviours, but what are the behaviours that are most critical, that are non-negotiable? What are the things that buy you a membership of this team? And when you can identify them and you get them really clearly understood and you hold people to account for it, there's a really crude term that people talk about, and I know it's a term that your listeners might have heard in sport. It's about the FIFO effect kicks in, where people either choose to then fit into that culture or they fuck off from it. Or if you want to reply to, they find a way out. But you can only do that when the behaviours are defined. So the phrase I use, as I said, is I talk about trademark behaviours. So I'll give you a good example. I was lucky enough, I've been friends with a couple of really quite elite rugby league coaches over the years. One of them, Tony Smith. We've worked together at Leeds Rhinos, then with England, and I went to Warrington with him for the first 5 years. And when we went into Warrington, that was a question we asked our players there. So the first question we said is, how would you define yourself? And it was a bit of a mixed bag. They hadn't won for a long time. They'd had a bit of a tough time, and the players effectively told us that they were talented, but they were erratic. They said that they felt like they could be a little bit more professional, but they felt that they were when things went against them, their resilience wasn't so high. Things like that. So we asked them, how did they want to be perceived instead? What were the trademark behaviours that they wanted to be renowned for? And very quickly, they identified three. First one was professionalism. The second one was mental toughness. And the third one was they wanted to be renowned as a team that stuck together. So what we did was, we then said to them, right, so how do we make these behaviours become a reality? So the first thing we did was we got the players to score themselves, because you have to raise their awareness. You have to know how they score. And what we found is that some of our better players or more highly decorated players, ones that scored themselves, say, 9 or 10 on the scale of behaviours, what was interesting was their perception amongst the dressing room. Because for a couple of them, the scores were around 4 or 5. So we had an issue there in terms of how they perceived themselves versus how they were being perceived by the group. So what we had to do was work with those individuals to get them to see that maybe they were being truthful, but people weren't observing the behaviours that they were demonstrating. So then we had to work with them to say, so either they demonstrate the behaviours a little bit more, or maybe they needed to raise their standards. As leaders, as highly decorated players, they needed to raise their standards and demonstrate those behaviours in a more obvious way. And what we found in that case there was that we kept 90% of the same group, but we were able to really start to deliver quite high level behaviours that manifested itself in results. So I'll give you a really simple example the players came up with. They identified that if we were serious about one of our trademark behaviours being we stuck together, they were the only team I've ever seen do this, but whenever we used to walk out of the tunnel, they refused to walk onto the field until they were all gathered. So they never walked out on the field in a single file. They would always walk out onto the pitch in a pack at half time. They wouldn't run in individually. They'd gather in the centre circle and run back in together as a pack, and they'd do it. Because to them, that was a manifestation of the behaviour, of the trademark behaviour they wanted to embody, which was, we stick together. There's no individuals in this team. We're a unit that work together. So there's lots of ways it can start to take life, and you see ways that it can really come into being in a culture. But you can't create a culture until you know what the behaviours are, is the essence of the point I'm making.
So what was your role at official title at Warrington?
I'd probably say it was a coaching consultant in that regard. But that's only for want of trying to explain it in a better way.
Of course.
So, the role I do, or the role I enjoy doing in sport, is working with the coaches and the support staff, rather than necessarily with the players. And the reason I say that, it's not that I don't work with the players, but I think the coaching and support staff are the ones with credibility in any sporting organisation, because they're the ones that determine the players' day-to-day lives, and the coaches determine whether you're in the team or not. So my interest is working with them to almost equip them with some of these ideas and skills to be able to implement them, rather than try and be the guy that leads it up myself. You know, I have done that, and at Warrington, for example, and previous with Tony, we're friends first and foremost, so I was lucky that he trusted me that the messages that I would give were going to be entirely consistent with any message that he would be issuing himself. But that came over a long period of time, and that came through the strength of our relationship rather than anything else.
Mm-hmm. So one thing we chatted about beforehand was this idea of being linked to a manager, and ideas been diluted because of the nature of, predominantly the nature of sport, and the fact that you can be gone within 20 minutes after a game, like Roy Hodgson.
Yeah.
But then obviously you were friends with the manager at Warrington.
Yeah.
Just using that as an example, maybe not yourself, but what are your ideas regarding that? Regarding the one member of the support staff or the whole support staff being linked to that head coach or manager, and what potentially is the downfalls of that?
Yeah, I've seen it in terms of, I think, I do understand it, you know, and I know that you know this better than anyone else, that sport can be a fickle business. And so I understand that people, when they become aligned to a particular coach or a particular organisation, there's a level of security, and that's great. But I also think there's a danger to that as well, because I often say that in any culture, you can often see people fall into two categories. And the phrase we were talking about earlier was, people can either very quickly become time tellers or truth tellers, is a phrase that I use. And what I mean by that is, I saw this so the boxing club that I've been involved in for a long time, I see this in boxing, for example, where I remember years ago, my dad had a young boxer that he developed from being a kid, a lad called Michael Gomez. He was a super featherweight and British champion and won a European title. And you get a lot of hangers-on, a lot of time tellers in boxing, you know, in the entourage. And this Michael Gomez, for example, he had people that wanted to be associated with him because he was having a fair level of success. And these guys tell the boxers everything that they want to hear rather than what they need to hear. They tell them they're great even when they've not been. They tell them that they look fantastic even when it's obvious that they haven't. They convince them that they can get away with shortcuts even though that's not necessarily the case. And because these guys want to be part of the inner circle. I remember Michael Gomez had a fight against some Mexican kid, and it was a warm-up fight for a European title, so it was just seen as a fight designed to tick over. And everything we'd heard in the build-up to the fight was the Mexican had come over, I think it was November, so it must have been freezing for him coming over here to the UK. And it was obvious from everything we'd heard was that he didn't particularly fancy it. And yet, when we got in the ring on the night, one of these entourage, one of these time tellers that I'm describing, carried the belt into the ring. And when he carried the belt into the ring, he started making sort of threatening, throat-cutting gestures to the Mexican kid who was waiting in his corner for Gomez to arrive. And I distinctly remember looking in this Mexican's eyes, and you could see that this sort of resolve started to come into it, as he was being insulted by this hanger-on and made to look a bit of a fool. You could see that he obviously resolved that he wasn't going to put up with that. And he ended up giving Michael Gomez one of the toughest 12-round fights that he'd ever had in his career, which was never what we actually needed in this particular fight. And so I could see the dangers of when you allow too many people into your corner that want to tell you their time rather than tell you the truth, if that makes sense. They wouldn't be associated with it for the wrong reasons. So where the sort of phrase comes from is what the idea of time tellers is. I say, I've worked with coaches that have had support staff that do this. So in a game, when they're looking for advice or for somebody to offer an opinion, these are the guys that'll tell you that there's 20 minutes left. And my view is, anyone can tell you the time. That's the easiest role in the world, just to be able to tell you how long there is or how many substitutions you've got left. What the best cultures have are truth tellers, people that will, and when I say truth, I'm not saying that they're right, but somebody that will challenge your thinking or throw in different ideas to generate debate or get people discussing points. And I think the value of those guys can be incredible. And that's why, I mean, that's part of the nature of the role that I do, that I try, we were saying it earlier, that I think my value can be coming into teams occasionally, but not necessarily being there every day of the week, because I think my role requires somebody to be a little bit more detached from that, who doesn't have the level of dependency that other people necessarily have on being in that role and making sure that their job is safe and secure.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So just one last thing that I kind of want to discuss, and something that we haven't had on the podcast, is someone that's been so involved in something maybe not completely detached from sport, but involved with business.
Yeah.
In a very global question, what can sport learn from business, from your experience?
I mean, that's a brilliant question, Rob. I mean, because I often hear it the other way. I often hear business, what can we learn from sport? And my answer to whenever I say that to businesses, I say, well, just be a little bit more circumspect about what you can learn from it. Because the reason I say that is because in sport, employment law doesn't necessarily always get a lot of respect. So if, people can get rid of you at the drop of a hat in some of the more high profile sports. And I say this to business, I say where you don't have that luxury to be able to do that. So at that very point, any parallels start to come apart at the seams. But when it comes to dealing with people, I think that's where the two worlds have got an awful lot to teach each other, both sport to business and business to sport. And I think it's more around the focus on culture. I think being really quite focused on making sure that get your culture right and bring good people within a culture, and it can sustain itself. I think businesses can often go down the route of looking for the short-term fix as well, like replaces the chief exec and see if we get some kind of bounce in it. I think the idea of that strive for continuous improvement, that idea of looking for how do we get better, having the willingness to look outside your own industry, for examples, or your own sport. I mean, I think there's three common mistakes that you'll see being made in cultures that struggle. First of all is the drive for results. So when you base your self-esteem or your success just on the results that you get, I think that can be a dangerous thing. So a lot of businesses, I think we've seen this in the banking sector in the last decade or so, just hit your numbers. And I think what that encourages is unethical behaviour, because as long as you're hitting your numbers and getting the big bonuses, don't worry about the collateral damage that happens in the wake of it. So I think you see, like British cycling, the idea of focus on the process, get the process right, and the outcome will take care of itself. I think that's one big thing. The second mistake we see being made is what the Latin phrase for it sounds a bit grand, but is marasmus, the idea of learned helplessness. Learned helplessness can take place in big organisations where people believe that I'm just a cog in a wheel, I don't really have much influence, and will quickly start to give up rather than try and shape a culture. I think sport gives you some great examples of where having that doggedness and that resilience can make a difference. I think the final mistake that a lot of businesses make that they can learn from is this idea of being quite myopic. A lot of businesses believe that they can only learn from other businesses or their industry contains the answers. Whereas I think if you get your head up and start having a look at the bigger picture, start having the courage to explore other worlds, other sports, other industries, you'll often find some really quite fascinating learnings that you can take and apply to your own. And I think, as we was talking about earlier, you look at the best sports, they've got that constant striving to learn and pick the brains of others. The worst sports tend to be quite insular and focused just on themselves.
Is there any specific examples from the business world that could be you could give that kind of sport could tap into?
Yeah, the example I talk about, or that I would quote for you here, is there was a brilliant article years ago by a guy called Theodore Levitt in the Harvard Business Review, and he talks about this idea of marketing myopia. And what he means by that is that he tells the story of the kerosene industry in the 19th century. So in the 19th century, if you were one of the leaders in the kerosene industry, you were like the Bill Gates of your day. You were just like a wealthy industrialist, because kerosene was what we used for our gas lights and things like that. And when Theodore Levitt gets extracts from interviews with these guys and he says, "And what do you do?" Their answer is always, "We're in the kerosene industry. We make kerosene. We produce kerosene." By the 1930s, if you were a leader of the kerosene industry, you were pretty much bankrupt. You were extinct and irrelevant from that moment on. And the answer is, why, is because Thomas Edison at Menlo Park was coming up with the way of introducing mass illumination on a grand scale. And the kerosene industry missed it. So gas lamps weren't required in the same volumes anymore, because mass electricity was on its way. And what marketing myopia says is, if those kerosene leaders would have seen themselves not as being leaders of the kerosene industry, but of being in the illumination industry, they'd have been funding Thomas Edison at Menlo Park, and they'd have been at the vanguard of just adapting and innovating. Now, you go into any failing culture, you'll see the same myopia existing. So you look at a modern day example, say the post office in this country, here in the UK, where it's pretty much seen as struggling to justify its relevance in the modern world. And the answer is because they viewed for years, the leaders of the post office viewed themselves in the delivering letters industry. When if they'd have taken a step back and said, actually, we're in the communication game, they'd have been at the forefront of introducing email and the other digital communication to us, and they'd have been able to do it in a way that they could have controlled the market. So I suppose the lesson that we can learn there is sometimes having the willingness to reinvent, having the courage to not just keep doing what you're doing, but step back and just revise what you're doing and ask yourself, can we do this better? Can we improve on it? Is something that sport does that business could really adapt and learn from.
Very interesting. Well, I'm just, again, like every week, I'm just conscious of time, but you've got the book out on the 13th of July.
That's right.
Is that correct? Where can people get hold of it?
It's on Amazon. I think Amazon's the easiest way. That's the best way to do it. There's a book launch in Manchester on the 13th of July at Waterstones. If people want to come along, I think tickets are, I think they're nearly sold out. So if you contact the bookstore there, and I think there's another proposed one due to take place in London in September. But Amazon's the best way, or people are welcome. If people want to get in touch with any questions about it, I have a website called liquidthinker.com. People are welcome to drop me a line there, and I'm more than happy to pick up and answer any questions about the book as well, Rob.
And you've got Twitter as well. Come up with some funny little bits and bobs.
Yeah, I don't actually understand Twitter. I was advised a few years ago to get on it, so I sort of racked my brains for a long time trying to think of, well, what do you actually say? It just seems so inane. So I don't post anything in terms of like, this is what I've had for my tea, this is what I'm doing. I just, I read pretty voraciously when I'm doing the research, so I just try and share insights or quotes from people I'm meeting that I've got something interesting to say, or anything I've read that I think might be of interest to people. So it's pretty eclectic, but it seems a fun way of just sort of sharing some of those insights, because that's really my interest. My interest is about helping people and cultures just to improve in their own way, not telling them what to do, but getting them to think and identify it. So again, that's why I've loved coming on here. I appreciate the invitation, and it's the same for any of your listeners as well. I hope they found it interesting, and if I've got any questions, I'm happy to help try and answer them or clarify.
No, that's great, mate. I really appreciate your time. So are you linked with Liquid Thinker on Twitter as well? You know?
Yes, I am. Yeah, that's me. Yeah, Liquid Thinker. Yeah.
Perfect.
I mean, so when people ask, they say, "Why do we call it Liquid Thinker?" Well, many years ago now, about 15 years ago, when I was trying to think of a name for a business, I say it's a multiple choice question. This one. Say the first one is Edward de Bono, the creativity guru, says that 90% of the mistakes you make in life are what we call through solid thinking, that inability to see things from a different angle. So I thought liquid thinking, it's the opposite of it. And you see what I'm trying to do. The second multiple choice answer that you could decide is that I was actually sat in the pub with my mate when we were trying to come on the title. And the answer is both of them are true. The more realistic one is I was sat in the pub with my mate. Yeah.
Well, it's been great to chat to you.
I've loved it, Rob. Thanks for having me.
I really appreciate your time, and we'll catch up soon.
Yeah, look forward to it. Thank you. Cheers, mate.
Well, cheers, mate.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in to episode 94 of the Pacey Performance Podcast. Just before I let you go, just want to say a massive thanks to both Val Performance and Train with Push for sponsoring episode 94 today. So got some great guests coming up over the next couple of weeks, building up to the big 100. So hopefully got something special for you for number 100. So that's something to look forward to. Thanks again for tuning in. Really appreciate your support. If you have enjoyed the podcast so far, if you'd be so kind enough to get over to iTunes and leave an honest rating and review, that'd be really appreciated. Just make sure the podcast gets out to more and more people, so would really appreciate that. So thanks for tuning in, and I will speak to you in episode 95.